Hello, listeners, and welcome to Bite-Sized Tales, your audio flash fiction podcast. In this week's story, a return trip to a space station doesn't quite live up to the nostalgia built up around it. Welcome to Toran Station, written and read by Wayne Cole. Welcome to Toran Station, the gateway to the galactic frontier. I could barely contain my excitement hearing the announcement come over the speakers. This was the station I had visited with my father when I was 10. Returning here felt like recapturing a bit of my childhood that had been long lost. I might have been traveling for business, but I felt like it was a dream vacation. I headed to my locker in the sleeping compartment. First class had their own cabins, but my company was not willing to foot the bill for that level of extravagance. Instead, I shared a room with 3 other passengers. The beds were bunk in the wall, but they had partitions so you could pull down to gain a little bit of privacy. Space is a premium on tiny transports, and they needed to utilize as much as they could to make a profit. That also meant very strict rules for what luggage I could carry with me. I had 1 bag in my locker, and I just hoped my other really was in the cargo bay. It would not be the first time my luggage had been lost in transit. I stepped through the airlock and took a deep breath of station air. I almost choked on it. The air was musty with a strong metal and grease tint to it. That had not been what I was expecting. I remembered on my first trip the air being the cleanest I had ever breathed. This was worse than the air on the tiny transport that had brought me here. Finally, I managed to compose myself and take in the sight of the hall. On my first trip to Toran Station, it had just begun operation. All the news reports talked about the gateway to the galactic frontier and how it would open up a new era of exploration and colonization. The station had all the newest technology built right into the foundations. Everything was awe-inspiring, no matter where you looked, because it was all new and full of promise. The station that met my eyes did not live up to my memories. The airlock opened to a hallway that had 2 lights completely out and a 3rd flickering. The flickering light made shadows dance. There were grease stains on the floor and a panel missing from one of the walls. I could see a maintenance worker at the end of the hall with a mop. His cleaning effort could not compare with the robotic cleaning drones that constantly cycled the halls on my first trip. I followed the signs to baggage claims. Thankfully, the walls were labeled very clearly because they all looked identical to me. It would have felt a bit like being in a maze if each corridor didn't seem to have its own odor. Grease gave way to burnt electronics, only to finally give way to what I was pretty sure was urine. I was grateful that the baggage claim room was extremely clean compared to what I had just walked through. There was only 1 stain on it I could not identify, and most of the lights functioned. My bag was fairly easy to find, as we were the only ship that was arriving that day. Remembering just how busy the station had been, I couldn't understand why that would be when I booked passage. Now that I was seeing its current state, it was much easier to understand. I decided it would be best to take my luggage and just be grateful that it had not gotten lost in transit. All that was left was to decide if I should check in with work or the room that I had reserved first. The unwieldy nature of my luggage helped me make my decision. I stepped up to an information kiosk to find the path to the room that work had rented for me. Of course, the first kiosk was sitting on an error screen, but the second one was responsive. It only took a few moments to get the information I needed and determined that I would have to walk halfway across the station to get where I needed to go. My path took me through one of the market courtyards. It was a large 3-story corridor with shops lining both sides and a bank of elevators between the floors. This was by far the busiest place I had seen so far on the station. It looked like about 1/4 of the shop fronts were available for rent, but the ones that were open had multiple customers. The market of my memories was so crowded that Dad made me hold his hand to avoid getting separated. This market was not crowded, but it was the cleanest room that I had seen so far. The lights and kiosks all seemed to be functioning as well. My memories fought with reality. I smelled fresh-baked bread, and it brought me back to having lunch with my dad at a deli on the 3rd floor. The music coming from the speakers reminded me of the live performances on the balcony of the 2nd floor. It was far from the courtyard of my memories, but there was just enough for me to see what it looked like in its prime. I was so lost in my memories that I didn't see the woman in front of me had stopped until I bumped into her. We both tumbled to the decking, with me dropping my bag and her dropping the tablet she had been taking pictures with. "I am so sorry," I said, scrambling back to my feet, not even trying to grab my bags. I held my hand out to try and help her up. "I really should watch where I'm going better." She took my hand and let me pull her to her feet. "First time on station?" She was smiling at me, and I wondered why she wasn't more annoyed. She was dressed simply, wearing a shirt without any logos on it. I wondered if she was local, or perhaps on a work trip as well. "Actually, no, I was here when I was a kid, probably 25 years ago." "Not living up to your memories, is it?" I was taken aback by her observation. "How can you tell?" She held out her hand for me to shake. "Janice Harrington, being observant is kind of my job, and that look on your face says volumes." Her grip was firm, but not testing. "Yeah, it probably does. I'm James, by the way. I'm here from Harrison Accounting to do an audit of the station books. Seems that some numbers just aren't adding up, and I jumped at the chance to come see the place again." I could see her eyes light up, and she immediately started typing out something on her tablet. "Well, James, I'm sending you my contact information. Why don't you settle in, and then I can treat you to some lunch." It was then that I finally registered that she was a reporter. I had just dropped the seeds of a potential financial scandal for her station in her lap. My boss was not going to be happy at all. "Why do I think having lunch with you could put my job in danger?" "Trust me, a good reporter protects her sources." She turned to walk towards the elevator, but stopped and looked back over her shoulder at me. "Hard to get a second story if they don't." I just shook my head at her and moved on towards my room. I had work to do, and probably a lot more disappointment to experience before my trip was done. And now a word from our author. This originally came out on a Fiction Fragment Friday back in 2022. During the time, I was developing the setting of Toran Station. I recorded a bunch of episodes for a podcast I was doing called Fear the Boot Game Notes at the time, where I worked through the technology on the station, the departments, things like that. But no setting is real to me until I've written fiction in it. With that in mind, I started doing weekly stories about Toran Station and about this character on my Fiction Fragment Fridays. There were at least 5 stories before I moved on to something else, and one of these days I do want to come back and tell the full story that I had in mind for it. It was one of those things where, as I went on, I kind of lost my way in the story and wrote myself into a corner I didn't care for. When you're actually releasing parts of it every week, it's a little harder to recover from that than it is when you're just writing for yourself and can go back and edit. Let me know what you think of the setting, and maybe I'll go back and read more stories from Toran Station, or perhaps finish up the story. This chapter of Bite Sized Tales has been brought to you under a Creative Commons Attribution, Non-Commercial, No Derivatives 4.0 International License. Intro and outro music is Fantasy Motion by Alexander Nakarada, provided under a Creative Commons 4.0 license. If you enjoyed what you heard today, we would greatly appreciate reviews and recommendations to your friends. Finally, for more information about our authors, please visit bitesizedtales.com. We look forward to reading to you next time.